Oh, thank you. Yeah.
All right.
Recording in progress.
Thanks so much, everybody, for joining today. I know there's a few other events going on this evening, so we really appreciate everyone who's here. For those of you who I haven't met in person, I'm Karthik Balakrishnan. I'm one of the pediatric otolaryngology faculty. So we're sequestered over at Packard on the cuter side. Today we have a really great panel of faculty members and colleagues from our department who are all leaders in innovation and sort of creative thinking when it comes to clinical care. And we're going to talk about some topics related to that. So the title for today is called The Aftermath of Innovation. In other words, once you have an idea and you start to put that idea into practice, how are those ideas regulated? How are they disseminated? How are they adopted? And so we have four wonderful panelists with us today. We have Dr. Tony Ricci, who's a professor of otolaryngology and molecular and cellular physiology. He's a renowned researcher in inner ear physiology and function, and has worked with Alan Cheng and others to innovate, including focus on the development of non-ototoxic antibiotics. He's also a leader in developing DEI in basic science. Dr. Ricci is going to join us by Zoom partway through. Oh, there he is. Hello, sir. So Dr. Ricci is here. Kindly joined us after traveling back home today. Then we have Dr. Kara Meister, who's assistant professor of otolaryngology and surgical co-director of the Children's Thyroid Clinic. She's a leader in the American Thyroid Association and alumni of the Stanford Biodesign Fellowship. We have Dr. Peter Huang, who's a professor of otolaryngology and neurosurgery, who's a expert rhinologist and skull-based surgeon, who has an interest in new and off-label applications for medications in topical therapy and sinonasal disease. And then Dr. Julia Noel, who's an assistant professor of otolaryngology and soon-to-be member of the Santa Clara Valley Medical Center otolaryngology team. She has been a unit medical director at SHC, faculty senator for our department, and is a beloved teacher for our residents, and has been an innovator in thyroid surgery, often in collaboration with Dr. Meister. So we've got these different colleagues who are going to talk about different aspects of innovation, and we're going to do this as a panel where we'll pose some questions to the panelists and have them talk about their own experiences in innovation. If anyone can't hear us as we go, please do speak up, because we want to make sure that the discussion is conveyed. All right, so just as a reminder, again, please look at your Outlook invitation for the code to text for your CME credits. All right, so if we can start, Dr. Ricci, are you feel like you're set, or should we?
Muted.
Yeah, we can't hear you quite yet, but.
How about now?
Yes, sir. Thank you so much. Lovely. I hope you had a good trip back. So we'll start with you, Dr. Ricci, and curious if you could tell us a little bit when you're working as a scientist and you have an idea that strikes you as something that has potential applications in the commercial space, in the clinical space, or applications beyond the development of knowledge for the sake of science. How do you think about how to take the next step in terms of transitioning that?
Okay, so it kind of depends a little bit on what the idea is. For drug development, I started by using the SMART program, which does drug development, and tried to learn about it and get their insights into whether it was a real project. The main reason I'm in a clinical department is to have clinicians as a resource. So if I have an idea, I think talking to clinicians who actually are using these things and would have an idea of whether it's valuable, whether it would be something that could translate, into a practice. I talk to the people I think most relevant to use it, to get some feedback there. I talked to the office of, was it OTL, Office of Technology Licensing or something like that, because they kind of do the due diligence around whether it's already been done, who's there, who's in the space kind of thing, whether they'd be willing to support trying to transition it, that type of thing. I mean, for me, I start with the foundation is the basic science, like is it actually valid and a reasonable way to go? When I'm convinced of that, then I move forward. That's my strength, and so I lean on others for their strengths. I mean, that's
Got it. And when you're planning a course of scientific investigation, do you consider clinical or commercial applications at that time? And if not, can you explain a little bit about why you don't?
so it depends again. I mean, most of the work that I do is really foundational for understanding how the normal processes work, so that with the idea that if you understand that, then you can identify targets for when things break down or fail to work. I guess I'm always looking at it through multiple lenses. So I tend to work at the cell level, biophysical level, but I'm always thinking at the systems level. Like, am I asking a question that actually matters? If I'm studying something at the cell level that you get rid of it and it doesn't change whether you hear or not, it's probably not all that important to study, right? So I think about it there. And then I think about, well, is this something that actually tends to be a weak spot in the system, someplace that does go off, that does go wrong, that where work needs to be done? So that's how I kind of pick where I'm going to be, and then depending on where that result is taking me, I look for the translational application. I mean, the aminoglycosides is I think a good example of this. I was studying the biophysical properties of a specific ion channel in hair cells. What we found was that the channel was actually a much bigger pore than was previously estimated. And that made me realize that potentially it's so big that, drugs and things like that could get through it. So whereas they had been, like aminoglycosides, had been thought to block the channel, but not specifically not go through it. And so then what we found was that it actually could go through it, and so that became a second direction in the lab. So it started with, I want to understand this ion channel. We realized, now this is a site of entry of toxic drugs. Now we know it is the site of entry of aminoglycosides. We're in the process of testing because they also think it's the site of entry for cisplatin. And so we're going to then look at cisplatin at the cell level to see if that's a reasonable, if it does that. If it does that, then we would reach out and look at drug designs again to prevent it from getting in, that kind of thing.
Got it. Thank you. So it sounds like it's sort of a constant back and forth consideration of,
I will say that on the commercial side is something I don't naturally tend to think about, and that I can tell you my wife is angry with me about that, because we have actually designed a bunch of microscopes and parts and things like that other companies have made a lot of money on, and I never realized that I was happy that they gave me the microscope to use in the lab after beta testing it. I didn't think, I should be getting a cut of the product. So that's something I'm trying to work on, but there's no actual ethical reason or something. I'm not opposed to making money. I just haven't been very good at it so far.
Got it. Well, thank you for explaining that. We're going to jump now to Dr. Meister and talk a little bit about novel devices and novel applications of devices. So Dr. Meister, when you're thinking about bringing a new device into the clinical realm or into your practice, what kind of obstacles have you come across, and what have you done to overcome that?
Sure. So I think about this kind of at different points along the pathway. And so taking a step back and really understanding, what is the clinical need? Like, why are we bringing something in? What is the problem that we're trying to solve? Who's the population? What are the alternatives? Trying to frame it that way can sometimes help you realize that maybe there is something that already exists that could be adopted, and that's always an easier path to take than true de novo innovation. Less lucrative, less notoriety, but if your ultimate goal is to improve the care of the patient, then that's oftentimes the best way to go because there are significantly less barriers. So it's all about determining that clinical need and really understanding everything about it, from the pathophysiology of why this is all the way up to how that's implemented in the clinical setting, and where along that journey could we introduce something that might make a difference. And so one of the things that I think about is when we think about airway obstruction, and we have a really challenging problem of distal obstruction of large airways, especially in our cardiac population. So we're talking behind the sternum, really difficult to access. How can we stent that area open? And there's been a lot of notoriety around some of the external splints. They have their faults. So in our group, we looked to what else is existing. So we have used a Gore-Tex, a VBX intraluminal stent that's used in the vasculature, and put it in the airway. And I would say that the number one lesson there is do it with your partners, right? So that maybe the first times that you're doing it, you can have an extra set of hands and think through the things that you wouldn't necessarily think through with just your own experience. So everything from putting them in to taking them out, I think loading the boat and sharing that experience is hugely important. So we've had great success, and we didn't need to invent a whole new system, and have done well clinically. The other problem that I'm interested in solving is preventing unplanned extubations in our NICU population. We were talking some earlier today, Dr. Nack and I, about this problem, and it's different in children than in adults. The problem is that the anatomy is different. We're talking about millimeters of movement. The implications are different. So like Dr. Ricci said, is this important? Well, if you're looking at it through an adult lens, oftentimes when the endotracheal tube comes out, people say, we should have extubated them a while ago. They did great, right? But in children, about 66%, 2/3, have a cardiopulmonary event. It costs the hospital around $40,000 and is now a reportable adverse event in the ICU that goes into metrics like U.S. News and World Report. So the patient level and the system level are hugely impacted. And so thinking about how to redesign that around that clinical problem, well, we can think about it from training, education, which is where most of the work has been done, teaching our nurses and RTs. We can think about monitoring, so we detect movement, we look for, or we can think about the hardware itself, right? Like, can we make a tube that's less likely to come out? So my specific interest is in looking at that hardware, and I would say the biggest challenge that I've faced is aligning the collaboration with the engineering colleagues. You often have different goals in mind and different academic metrics to help incentivize that collaboration. So being really transparent from the beginning about what are your goals, what are your must-haves, and how can each of these two vantage points come together to make that happen. And I think being upfront with things like the Office of Technology Licensing, and if you're going to co-invent and what the IP looks like, not only is the right thing to do ethically and scientifically, but it also adds a little bit of excitement around the project because it legitimizes it in a way. So that's my long-winded answer to your question.
Terrific, thank you. And how have you gotten buy-in from patients and families when you introduce these new technologies?
Yeah, so I think the first thing is full disclosure, that, we're going to do something that's off-label, and letting them know that. And, we're often doing it because there is no comfortable alternative. So we're either, in this setting of these VBX stents, the alternative is a repeat cardiac operation, often in a child that's already had surgery that has significant morbidity, right? And so we can try something that we think is less invasive. We've also been using off-label the Propel stents, especially nasal, and just letting them know that our goal here is to prevent more the rate of reoperation for some of these nasal stenoses, but it is off-label. We don't know, and that's really the one big thing. The other big piece is working with the operating room and there's a committee to bring new things in to make sure that that's all, that paperwork is taken care of before the day that you want to use it, because that can take quite some time, especially if it's a new vendor.
And is there anything specific you do to work with these companies or vendors ahead of time? Or do you notice any obstacles when you propose a new application for their devices?
I think they're always more than happy to explore new indications, but again, just being very clear about this is the goal, and these are the potentially bad things that we could come of what we're doing. Really, it's about transparency, but we've had great engagement with our reps so far. So
that's terrific. Thank you. So, Dr. Huang, I'm going to jump to you next and ask you a little bit about medical therapy as opposed to devices. When you come up with an idea for a new application for an existing medication, how do you work with the university and the hospital to put that into practice? And is that different than what you would do for a device or a technology?
Yeah, well, I think it's very different. I think the thing with off-label use of medications is that we tend to have information about safety already because we're using FDA-approved medications in non-approved ways. So I think that does help in terms of assessing, whether, with the likelihood that something is going to be a viable option for a patient. How you get to that place of comfort of doing that, I think, is very challenging because some drugs have a very good safety record and some have potential for significant complications. I would say, in general, I am not engaged with the school and the hospital, and that's being recorded, right? So if I don't show up to work tomorrow, you'll know at least somebody bailed me out. But actually, I did look into this a little bit because I wasn't really sure, but we do have legal protections to use medications off-label. So the FDA approval, it's kind of like pregnancy-rated drugs, so category C is like FDA not approved. It's disapproved, it's just not approved. So it's like the category C pregnancy drugs, it's just, there's no studies that exist to support it. It doesn't mean that it's not safe. So we have that privilege of using drugs in an off-label way, but we also have the responsibility of making sure that we're applying them in a judicious way. So I don't think, unless it's a very risky drug, that we have to create an IRB to administer that, and I'm certainly open to input from our panelists on that. But when I look at how much off-label use, off-label medication I use, I just went through a list. Like in the last week, what did I do? Today I put intrathecal fluorescein in, and that on the label says not for intrathecal use. So I did that. I prescribed gabapentin for facial pain, post-op pain. I injected Avastin for HHT. I've used a ton of topical budesonide for CRS and topical antibiotics. So, I am very glad that I have protection because my practice would look very different Now, how do you get to the place of saying that these things are okay? So I mentioned that some off-label medications are really, really safe, and some are extremely dangerous. Well, intrathecal fluorescein, if it's not measured correctly, is very, very dangerous, and that's why there's labeling on it. But we also know that it's been used for 25 years in the correct concentration. So then it's really incumbent on us to create the safe environment for the patient. I do tell patients that this is not FDA approved, but I also tell them that I've been using it for over 20 years, that I'm going to measure it myself and the precautions that we take. So, that's an example of a drug that's probably now just grandfathered in. Nobody's going to study the safety of that. Whoever makes fluorescein has no incentive to try to do a study to show that it's safe, because they know a certain percentage of their dollars are coming in for that. So that's one example. But then, the other times there's things that maybe we think they're safe, but we're not really sure they're helpful. And I think from an academic standpoint, that's an opportunity for us to actually validate these things. So things that we've done. A randomized clinical trial for Avastin for HHT, and we demonstrated efficacy. Safety data for budesonide. So we've done stimulated cortisol testing for patients who have been on it for more than a year. And we showed safety. So, I think trying to be a good citizen, bringing our resources to help clarify, the safety of these medications for our patients definitely facilitates the discussion with them when we're going to apply those things. Because I still say budesonide is off-label. I explain that to the patients. But then I can also say, but we've studied it, and so I feel very comfortable prescribing it for you because this. And if you'd like to see the paper, I can give this to you. So I guess that's why I feel like I don't need to engage, to your original question, a higher regulatory authority within the institution, because if somebody were to audit my use of it in the way that I counsel patients, I think, just like Dr. Meister said, we have to be transparent and disclose that to patients. So if we do that, we study the medication and we carefully monitor its use, then I think that there is a pathway there. And one other 5FU for recurrent inverted papilloma. So I just realized, so yeah, I'm all over the off-label.
Every category of medication possible.
I'm not smart enough to design a new therapy, so I have to shift towards repurposing existing therapies, but definitely something that happens a lot.
That's great. Thank you. And once you get to the point where you've studied it and you feel like for instance, the Avastin for HHT, if you feel like it truly is beneficial and you can support that with data, what do you do to take the next step then to actually disseminate that knowledge, potentially promote adoption outside of our institution, and potentially get regulatory approval for that?
Yeah. I mean, it's a great question. I think it probably depends a little bit on what the market is for it and how long the drug has been out. And also recognizing that we're in a small field and a lot of the things that we treat are small diseases. So I can just tell you for Avastin, when we ran that whole budget, a study on a shoestring budget, it was like $20,000 to fly people from 40 people from all over the country. I mean, the HHT Foundation helped us, the Academy helped us, one of the residents got a core grant. So we said, well, can we go to Genentech up the road and ask them for compassionate use donation of Avastin? That would really help us, because we're just paying for the drug and airplane tickets. And they said no. And I was so mad about it. But then I thought, oh, you know what? If I were some, CFO looking at that, it's do I really care about it? I mean, I care. The CFO, does he really care about something that affects one in, 100,000 people? No, he'd rather focus his money on the next blockbuster breast cancer drug. So I knew that even if we could show that it was beneficial, I would never have any FaceTime with somebody from Genentech to try to get them to say, well, get the FDA indication for HHT too, So it's kind of a sad fact, but, that's just what it is when you're taking care of rare diseases. And then other times I think, so like with budesonide, it's used so much that I'm sure the manufacturer of budesonide look at it and go, oh, there's ENTs prescribing an inhaled budesonide? Well, great. We already have that revenue stream. Why go and risk designing a study to show that maybe it's not effective? And then tank this revenue stream, right? So it's sort of this, pragmatic slash grim view of pharma, but I think that's what it is. So I think that's why, like, my goal for the studies that we do is to just create knowledge for ourselves. I usually create studies to answer questions about my own practice. And if I can share that with other people, that's great. But I don't make any delusions that that's going to change at a corporate level how drugs are indicated or, approved.
Sure. That makes sense. Makes sense. Thank you. That was great. All right, Dr. Noel. When you adopt a new operation, for example, your radiofrequency procedure for thyroid lesions, how do you spread the word about it to colleagues in the community to help build your practice?
I think we're fortunately living in a time where there are a lot of ways to do that there may not have been previously. But first and foremost, certainly use the contacts that you already have. I found, especially when we were engaging referring providers about doing transoral thyroidectomy, for example, anytime a patient would come to clinic and you would do a consult with them about their thyroid surgery, even if you didn't necessarily feel like the patient was a candidate for that particular type of surgery, it is worth a mention in the conversation and then documentation in your note that you had that conversation so that you can rely on, word of mouth from the patient and then the referring provider reading your note and saying, oh, hey, that's cool. Stanford is offering transoral thyroidectomy if I have another patient who's interested in that. And then, Stanford does have a market development team that you can reach out to, and they will do a lot of the legwork in contacting potential referring providers in the community and setting up meetings for you to present to them about any new procedures or techniques you might be using. Dr. Roloff and myself also took the opportunity to give grand rounds to our endocrinology colleagues who are our main referring providers, and I think that's a great way to educate people at your own institution as well as people in the community. There are always hospitals and clinics that are having lunchtime meetings or after work meetings at which they're looking for speakers. It's an easy way to get the word out. And social media is not at all my thing. But I have plenty of colleagues across the country who, have done a really good job of just getting their names associated with certain procedures. And that doesn't necessarily have to mean, having uncomfortable conversations with patients about posting pictures, et cetera. But just if you publish an article, for example, or you take part in a guideline or give a talk, those are all good ways to, publicize that you're involved with this particular procedure. And something that's been really interesting about radiofrequency ablation specifically, and will probably be the case even more so for other procedures as time goes on, is that there is now a whole network of patients that is social media based that communicate with each other about these procedures and about providers who are performing these procedures and their various experiences with said providers. So, generally these are not groups that the providers themselves have access to for probably, good and obvious reasons. But, I think from the provider standpoint, the moral of the story is, do good work because people will share their experience with you and share their outcomes, and you want that to be recommended positively.
Makes sense. And when you're thinking of bringing a new procedure into your practice, how have you done that in terms of working with the university or the hospital? to bring on? Do you just do it, or are there steps you've had to take to implement it from a safety or medical legal standpoint, from the perspective of the health system that we work in?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it can be really variable, and I think the variability depends a little bit on how established a procedure is nationally and how close to other established procedures that something that you're trying to incorporate might be. So, for example, we did help develop and then go through a privileging process at the hospital to be able to do, transoral endoscopic surgery. And that's now, a documentation that exists at the regulatory level, and if someone were interested in doing those procedures themselves would have a very clear, privileging process that they would have to go through. And, that probably stems from the fact that we have other endoscopic and robotic procedures in our department and our institution that have similar processes. But radiofrequency ablation, for example, was a totally different experience. And, that's something that even on a national scale right now, there is not necessarily a formal certification process for. And so it can be a little bit, tricky, I think, especially if you're a patient or a referring provider and you're trying to find, someone to do this procedure for you, and you want to know sort of what training that they've gone through in order to be able to do this. So, we've always put a lot of emphasis on having a strong foundation in ultrasound, which does have a certification and is part of a privileging process. But in radiofrequency ablation, I think right now a lot of it is on the individual person to ensure that they have gone through the requisite training process. But I'll say that if you are that person who's looking to do any new procedure, like Dr. Meister was saying, you want to have a buddy, you want to have someone who can, be there for your first few cases and can help each other out and learn from one another. And you also want to make sure that you're being transparent with the patients and you're letting them know that this is something that's new for you, and you have the background, you have the experience, but they have to be willing to go with you on that journey to some degree.
That's very well said. Got it. Now I have a question that I was going to kind of just go one by one and ask all of our panelists the same question, because I'm curious to see if people have a different view of this. Dr. Ritchie, I'll start with you. How do you balance keeping control of your ideas and being recognized as an innovator or somebody who developed that idea with sort of spreading the word so that other colleagues can adopt your innovations and build on them? Oh, sorry, Dr. Ritchie, we can't hear you.
There you go. Sorry, I didn't want you to hear the background. I guess I don't tend to honestly worry that much about it. So we always share our data prior to publishing it. We always publish our data as well, but I was just away working with a colleague, and we basically showed him some new technology that we're using that he's going to run with. We haven't published it. The people I trust. So I don't really worry that much about it. That's one of the things in academia. I do think people have gotten a little paranoid, to be honest, and I think that hurts science and hurts free expression of ideas. So I'm also a little bit arrogant, and I figure, if someone can try to do what we're doing, but we'll still do it better, so it doesn't really matter.
Got it. It helps to be the best, for sure. Okay. Got it. Thank you. Dr. Meister, how about you?
I have a few thoughts. So I think the first thing is to keep the overall global perspective that everything that we're doing is for the patient. And if somebody else has more bandwidth than me and can publish it faster, it's gonna get to more people faster, right? Like I think that sometimes we get caught up in our own personal agendas, but really it just comes down to disseminating the knowledge for the patient. That being said, I think that you can publish too fast if you haven't given enough time for outcomes. So if you're doing something new, I think you have to see it through, whether that's a year or 2 years, whatever the disease is in the natural history, to be sure that when you put that data out there for others, that you've legitimately understood the implications of what you've done. I think that's really important. And then the other thing, and I think Dr. Wong mentioned it, is this question of an IRB, right? And so we could probably talk the whole time about, do we need an IRB to do some of this stuff? Well, you definitely need an IRB to publish it. Do you need to wait on an IRB to bring something into clinical practice so that you can publish it? Well, to me, again, that's delaying treatment, and so maybe you can't include those first few patients in your study. Might be good for your outcomes, but I think that's always a balance as well. Is how do you do this? Do you have to do it on study or not?
Got it. Do you feel like, just a quick follow-up to that, do you feel like there's a potential difference in how patients are treated if they're on study or not?
No, not necessarily. Maybe they would get more algorithmic follow-up and protocoling, but hopefully not. Yeah.
All right. Dr. Wong, how about you? What do you think about?
I'm going to take a slightly different stance, which is I'm going to give everybody permission to protect your own creative ideas. It's not to say to sequester them and withhold things that could actually help people, but if they're immature ideas that you think you want to develop and bring to fruition, then it's very okay to keep that to yourself, to play your hand close. If there are things that you just know you can't ever take on and you want somebody else to do that, please share that idea, right? And that's what all of these grand rounds are about, is, creating new ideas that somebody else can take. I mean, so it's sort of a balance, right? I mean, I don't want to say, just practice defensive conversation and don't share anything, because then you'll never ever be on the receiving end of somebody else's, inspirational thoughts. But I do think, if you have something that's very close to your heart that you've been thinking about for a long time, you definitely don't need to talk to Medtronic about this new idea that you have and run it by them, right? I mean, maybe your close colleague that you do a lot of collaboration with, then for sure, because maybe they're going to help you or bring in a different skill, So I think there's a balance there, but I definitely want to give people permission to think carefully about how you document and protect your own IP.
That's a great point. Yeah, and it comes down maybe to what Dr. Ricci was mentioning before about trust and his trusting relationships with collaborators, because Medtronic clearly has a very different set of motivations than we do. And Dr. Nora, what do you think?
I agree. I think it's a balance, and I'm thinking back to Dr. Wong's talk about consulting experiences and situations in which it is beneficial to protect ideas that are in infancy, so that those aren't taken away from you. But there are also times when it's patient care at stake, and perhaps you put that aside. But case by case basis, I think.
I can reflect on one of my own experiences not too long ago, where one of my mentors in this department among the faculty, we're both working on a project with a company, and we needed to work with the engineers and the sort of innovators in the company, and that was incredibly useful and productive. But he was very careful to say that we should never talk to the sales team or the marketing team about it because that's a whole different boat with a different set of motivations and a different set of constraints on what they can do and what they can say and how they can help us. And so it was really interesting, talking very freely and openly with one set of people, and just down the hall there's another set of people who we pretend they're not existing, because they have, even within the same company, very different groups of people with different jobs, obviously. My last kind of question for the panel, and then we'll have a little time for Q&A, is when you're teaching your residents or your trainees or your postdocs or your graduate students about innovation, kind of what, if you could sum up your philosophy about how you approach innovation in a sentence or two, what would you say? I'm going to go in reverse order. Dr. Null, what do you think?
I'd say keep an open mind, think outside the box at all opportunities. I think this is a profession where, in training, your learning can be very directed and linear, and when you're out of training and you get to acquire all of this patient experience, then, you can finally sort of maybe regain some of that creativity that you might have felt like you had put to the side during the training process, and let that be the inspiration for your ideas.
That's great. Siobhan?
I think that we can create an environment where it's okay to ask questions that is part of the innovation process. It's not overtly innovative in and of itself, but the idea of that anything can be called into question. And also, I think a vulnerability from a teaching standpoint that we don't have all the answers. And that can also lead to new solutions. So I feel like if you just say, well, this is, it's Socratic method, I'm going to ask you this question and here's the answer I'm looking for, and then we'll just move to the next question. There's little room for innovation there, but so much of what we do is finesse and nuance and ad lib that I think if we talk through our thought process about why we do these things, or what is substantiated and what is not substantiated, then I think it helps people to understand where the opportunities are to either take research to a more, evidence-based place, or think about other things that are maybe better than what we're doing currently.
That's great. And that ties to this concept. Dr. Ahmad is sitting there. She's, a national expert on psychological safety, and this really brings in that idea of how do leaders create psychological safety. And it's by showing vulnerability and showing that we are fallible and that we don't know everything, so that other people feel comfortable asking those questions. And so as all of us, residents, trainees, postdocs, faculty, everybody else, we are all leaders of our teams, and so we have an opportunity there. All right, Dr. Meister, how about you?
I have two thoughts. So the first one is thinking about the clinical need, and there are needs everywhere, right? So there is a need for someone to figure out cord management in the operating room. That is a need. There are needs everywhere that we look. And so thinking about that clinical need and really mapping out that process tangibly, pen to paper, to see where along this pathway could I make a difference. And understanding that, I think, is really at the crux of innovation, because if you don't understand what the clinical need is, you can't ever understand the market. You can't ever find those, pearls in the journal from 1890 that actually you could now act on, that we understand, right? And so the first thing is the clinical need. And the second thing is there's a Southern saying that says, it's hard to see the dirt you're living in. So we get so ingrained in kind of doing the same thing over and over that we don't even notice some of the crazy things that we do that actually we haven't questioned, but we could question, and we could do better if we would just spend the time to notice it and innovate around it. And so I think sometimes getting out of your own space and, paying attention when you're in the ICU, in someone else's operating room where it's a little bit more uncomfortable may help you see those opportunities a little bit more. And so part of the formal biodesign training is actually going through the exercise of spending time with physicians from other specialties and walking through their day-to-day and pointing out to them things that you think seem illogical and inefficient, and then having someone else do that with you so that you can relearn how to be, the medical student who has the broad differential, who's thinking of all of these things. So that's my sentiment on that.
The beginner's mind.
The beginner's mind. It's
Yeah.
hard. It's easy to lose that.
Absolutely. And it ties to kind of what we teach the residents in the QI course, which is that so many things we do in healthcare are workarounds that we just do to get the job done expediently. And those workarounds become institutionalized. And we never stop to think what we were working around in the first place. And we do ridiculous things sometimes. Dr. Ricci, I'll finish up with you. What's your philosophy of innovation?
So in the lab, I tell everyone that they should be spending at least 30% of their time playing. So not every experiment needs to have a hypothesis. Sometimes you just need to do experiments because you're curious and you want to see what's going to happen, and you're not worried about what the answer is. It's just going to give you a new way to look at it. I think that's actually, that does not take away from experimental rigor or design or anything. But I think it's really important to know the difference between what you think and what you know. And, the thinking part is really important. And, getting the wheels turning usually happens accidentally. It happens by trying something that's like tweaking you. Like, I want to try this. I don't really know why. So go try it. There's probably a reason that you want to try it. You just haven't figured it out yet. So go give it a shot and see what happens.
That's great.
Usually for us, for me, it ends up being the centerpiece of the work you're doing, and not actually all the hypotheses you had going into building the data set. So I guess that's what I'd say.
That sounds wonderful. And it's seems like on the clinical side we don't always think about how to do that either. And sometimes it comes down to just having a free discussion with a colleague, and either over a beer or just over in the surgeon's lounge or whatever, just bouncing crazy ideas off each other. And sometimes you come up with really cool stuff. So that was our structured discussion. We have a few minutes for Q&A if anyone in the audience wants to pose anything to our panelists. Please feel free.
While we're waiting for someone to pipe up, I wanted to add around the balance of publication versus protecting your own ideas, that when you disclose your ideas in a public setting, and that could be publication in a medical journal, that could be a national presentation, that could even be our grand rounds here, it could be considered discoverable, which qualifies as prior art. So it is very, very important, even in some of the biodesign pitch competitions, that if you put a slide of your sketch, it can be considered prior art. So you could have just disqualified yourself from patenting because you disclosed yourself. So be very careful, and even consult with someone in OTL or just a trusted biodesign mentor before you apply for grants or give presentations. Something someone said reminded me, so I thought it was important to cover that.
Wow. That goes counter to so much of how we think about
It is very different. They actually say don't publish. Like, publication is kind of a negative thing in the innovation space, which is very much not what we do in academic medicine, but sometimes that excitement to get the idea and some of the preclinical stuff, it could really hurt you if you're wanting to protect that IP.
Wow, how interesting. Huh. All right. Thank you, Dr. Meister.
Wow.
Anybody in the audience have questions or thoughts? Please pitch in. If anyone, I know there are many innovators in this audience, so please feel free to speak up and share your own experience and views as well. Just start calling on people. See who's on the call. Open the Zoom and see who's on it, who I can call on.
Dr. Nayak's here, you can talk.
Recording in progress.
All right. So let's see.
I can ask a question. This is Liz Zambricki. I'm a former ENT resident, now in practice in Burlingame. And I think this concept of just the beginner's mindset and looking at problems from even a problem that might not even be considered a problem from a fresh set of eyes is really interesting because before I did a dual MD MBA, and I think before that I always felt like, okay, in order to start something or innovate on something, you really have to invent something new. And something I learned from a lot of my business colleagues is you can really just make something better, whether it be a process or a product. And so I'm wondering if any of the panelists have any examples of something that's come to fruition just kind of based on having that beginner lens.
I can talk a little bit about a newer collaboration. So one of the things that I noticed when we observed in the NICU is that they very rarely examine the baby because they don't want to open the isolette, and they very infrequently get lab studies. And so it seemed to me that we were always in a bit of a pull scenario where you had to have clinical suspicion that something was wrong, and then you'd go search for data to support that rather than having that data be pushed out. And so I started working with a group of engineers, and how can we understand at the tissue level that something is going wrong without having to necessarily examine the baby or be at the bedside. And it is a little bit Theranos-esque. I totally admit that. Grace challenged me to wear a black turtleneck tonight, but our case went too long. But it's led to a collaboration where we're trying to use molecular studies of biomarkers within a single line that basically push that data out without having to repeat sample. And so it's a well-funded collaboration for 3 years, and I think that it has morphed into a little bit of a different application, but it came from that initial, this is the problem that we see, how can we change this system? It actually doesn't have too much to do with otolaryngology at all.
Probably has a much broader impact because of that.
Yeah, hopefully.
I have one example. Hi, Liz. Thanks for joining us.
Hi, Peter.
I actually didn't think I had an example, and then I just realized one of our current clinical trials is an iteration of something that is currently done. So there is thought about sphenopalatine ganglion modulation of migraine and headache, and migraine and facial pain. And it actually came up at one of my sinus courses that I was giving like 10 years ago. I thought that's really strange. But then, I was interested in pain, and then I learned about this device called the TX360, and it was invented by a neurologist, and it was brought to me by the facial pain clinic, with whom we share a lot of patients. And they said, oh yeah, you can bill for a sphenopalatine ganglion block, and it helps like 30% of patients. And it's basically, I don't know if anybody's familiar with the data about lidocaine drops in the nose for migraine. So it's basically that idea, but in a device. And I said, oh, I would love to see this device. How can how's it different from what we're doing? And it's basically a modified spray bottle that we all spray the nose with. And so I said, well, why don't you bring it over and let me see where the spray is going, because it's just lidocaine. And it was Shang Chen, who's the one of the directors of the facial pain clinic, and he was really game. He was like, oh, let's figure this out. And so we sprayed it, and then we scoped the patient. It's like, that's not even close. That's just like spraying the nose for an endoscopy. So we can do better than this. And so I said, and I had actually been trying to get the attention of the pain guys. I said, you're approaching the sphenopalatine ganglion from the lateral approach, right? I mean, this super invasive approach under fluoro. And I said, we can like open the PPF or go through the roof of the mouth. And so when this came along, I'm like, well, if that even works, then we can just inject the nose at the sphenopalatine foramen. So that's what we decided to do. And actually now we're, using long-acting anesthetics. So bupivacaine, that's like 72-hour bupivacaine, slow release, and we're seeing improvements of up to like 1 month of modulation of intractable facial pain and migraine. So actually on Friday we're doing our first RCT patients. Michael Chang is leading that study. But it didn't really occur to me, Liz, until you actually raised this idea that actually was a modification of something that actually somebody else invented. That was probably an iteration of something else that somebody did before that, right? So yes, we do think we can do it better than that. So I think we just use that as the kind of the motivation. Like, and part of it is also like, hey, if somebody can make all that kind of money on this crappy device that doesn't even do what it's supposed to do, we can do better. So yeah, so that's my
Awesome.
example.
Thanks so much for those examples. Those are great.
Thanks for that question, Liz. That's great. I think we're just coming up on 7 o'clock, so I do want to wrap it up out of respect to everybody's time. But thank you so much to our panelists for sharing your expertise and your thoughts, and for everyone who's attended. And hopefully this was a good learning for everybody. I hope you all have a good night.